Well, hi, I'm Phil Hoffman, and I am one of the co-founders of Hub 88, and we'll welcome you to one of our second virtual Tech Talk. We've done Tech Talks for now 18 months or so, and Hub 88's mission is to ignite the next wave of innovation. We are a 501c3 not-for-profit organization run by volunteers and sponsors. And so we have been here trying to make an impact on the western suburbs and the greater Chicagoland area, helping to spur innovation. And we have some memberships. We've been helping companies with their product development needs. We have a communications lab that is located at the Nokia headquarters in Naperville. And we have one of the only 5G, publicly available 5G testing laboratories in the Midwest, maybe the only one in the Midwest that's publicly available for companies to come in and test their products and work with the real 5G network. And we have been working with some startups, and we have some entrepreneurship assistance with coaching and mentoring, primarily with touching base with our subject matter experts in different areas of technology. And we've been running a number of programs to really help educate and stimulate the community on issues regarding the technology, things that are impacting the way we live and work and learn. And that's today is going to be a great one. We have a website, hub88.org, hub88.org, that has a calendar of our events. We have some things coming up. We actually have a summer program that we're sponsoring for students in middle school and high school. That's an entrepreneurship class, kind of a boot camp that's virtual, starting just in another week or two. So check the website out for those events if you have students in middle school or high school that are interested in entrepreneurship and in the innovation process. The high school program is collaborating with the University of Iowa, and I believe that college credits would actually be available in that program. So that's pretty interesting. So we welcome you, and if you have any questions about membership at any level, please email hello@hub88.org. And now I'll pass it off to Lori Swanson, who will talk about the panel today.
Yeah, so I am Lori Swanson, and I am the CEO and founder of Inspire Tech. So we do information technology search and inclusion and unconscious bias work for organizations looking to build strong IT teams with women in tech. So that's kind of our mission. But for Hub 88, I am the programming lead. And what's happening with programming is, for the foreseeable future, it will be virtual. And just so you know, we are being recorded. It will then be saved out on the website for access in the future, and feel free to share it. We like that. We also have what's coming up is July. We take off, so it's fun month of family and sun and vacation and rest, hopefully, for all of us. And then in August, I'm super psyched, especially given that we are, of course, still in the throes of a pandemic, and with an uncertain future about what the fall is going to bring. And then, of course, the other serious incidents that are going on. But what we're focused on for August is health tech for better patient outcomes. So it's really about health technology. Nancy Fallon, who is on the programming committee, and along with Ramin, will be putting together an excellent panel on that. So look for emails information to come as soon as we get the panel confirmed. But the details as far as dates and everything, we're always, you know, the second Wednesday of every month, so that hasn't changed. But you can look for specific details about what companies are participating, what panelists will have, and you know, look at the problems that we're going to hopefully be able to solve through health tech for better patient outcomes. So I think that's going to be a really interesting topic, personally. Now, to move on to today's topic, I have the pleasure of introducing Michele Piazza. So Michele is also she's on the advisory board for Hub 88. She's super active in she's volunteer extraordinaire. You know, she's involved with the YWCA. She's been on their board since 2015, I believe. She also is involved in several other organizations throughout the Chicago area, like SIM, which is Society of Information Management, and the Information Systems Audit and Control Association, Senior Women in Tech, and some other ones. And that's because Michele started her career as a programmer. So she began her, you know, with U.S. Steel in Chicago. That led her to a 2-year international assignment in Venezuela, and eventually continuing to do technology roles, and then moving into leadership roles for Beatrice Foods, Citibank. She spent about 20 years with J.P. Morgan Chase as a senior VP, and now has her own company called MP Global Ventures that is specifically focused on security and technology management advisory for organizations. So you would not go wrong bringing Michele in to take a look at what's going on with regards to your tech and security and risk, for sure. She also is an athlete. So she's run, I think, 8 marathons. Is that right, Michele? Something like that. She does yoga and cycling and hiking and loves international travel. Her and her husband actually hiked up Mount Kilimanjaro. So she is passionate about tech, and she's passionate about giving back through her volunteerism, and she's passionate about her own health and vigorous life. So she's a force to be reckoned with. So we're lucky to have you, Michele, and please, you know, take it away from here.
Thanks so much, Lori, and thanks so much, Phil, for that gracious introduction, and also the information on our upcoming events at Hub 88. It's my pleasure and honor to be the moderator here this evening for our talented panel as we explore clean tech across earth, wind, fire, and water. And if you missed the music on the entrance, we'll be playing it at the end so we can all, you know, get up and dance a little bit. So we look forward to hearing from our highly accredited panel across their backgrounds, their expertise, and their insights. And so now I will shift to the panel, and we will have the panelists introduce themselves briefly and then give us their definition of clean tech, because we're all coming from a different space. And our panel is coast to coast tonight from Maryland, Chicago, Montana, and Seattle. So take it away. I'll look to Catherine Sheehy to kick this off.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can see you and hear you. Welcome.
Thanks. Nice to meet everyone, and thanks for having me. I am Catherine Sheehy. I'm the Global Lead of Sustainability Partnerships in the Environment and Sustainability Division in Underwriters Laboratories. Ken Boyce, who's also on the session today, is my colleague. UL, a lot of people know us for the work that we do in testing fire, shock hazard, and certifying product to enable safe use of that product. But we've actually expanded significantly since our founding in 1894 to address security issues, data interoperability, and sustainability issues, which is where I live and the piece of work that I focus on. But we often see increasingly, actually, that all of those domains, they're not distinct siloed domains. There's a lot of interaction, interrelationships between them. And so I'm looking forward to the conversation. My definition of clean tech is technology that enables people to do the things that they want to do and can't do as well without technology, but that does not deplenish our natural resources or befoul the earth in the process. And I would add that while it's not necessarily in the definition of clean tech, it's also got to be equitable. So I'm looking forward to the conversation and the discussion today.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Next, we'll go to Terry Gallagher. Terry, welcome.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. You guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. Yeah, so just briefly, my background, spent about 8 years in biotech, mainly around fermentation technology, and then just a little bit under 30 years working for Nalco Water and Ecolab. Amongst some of the experiences there, spent a few years managing a $1 billion portfolio of water treatment businesses around the globe. Also spent a couple of years managing about $900 million portfolio of water businesses, as well as cleaning and sanitation businesses down in Latin America. And also had the opportunity to lead our development of our digital strategy for the organization. So retired from that about a year ago, currently doing some independent consulting through Stratefin Consulting, as well as a venture partner with Mazarine Ventures. And Mazarine specifically really focus on early stage companies with innovation that's really addressing water and wastewater. And certainly attend more, getting a real focus around data science as well too, in terms of, in terms of driving the ship and the value proposition in the different markets. Relative to clean tech, from a broad context, it's all about resource management, in this case, water, with resource management, availability, reuse, recycle, et cetera, as well as fit for reuse water. So any products, services that help support that operational efficiency, productivity, efficiency of the product would really be the focus of where we're at.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Terry. Next up, Ken Boyce.
Thanks, Michelle. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here to speak with you. I'm Ken Boyce. I'm the Principal Engineer Director for Energy and Power Technologies at UL. As Catherine had said, we're a global safety science company really focused on safety and security and sustainability. I'm also a corporate fellow at UL. And I lead up our global technical practice relative to the entire energy and power technology suite. So it's all the renewables, energy storage, fuel cells, transport electrification, the oil and gas and biofuel business, industrial automation, and really glad to be here to speak with everyone about clean tech because it's so important in the energy sector. Really in the renewable energy world, everything we do is clean tech. So we're really trying to use those clean, sustainable sources to displace fossil fuels and advance the intelligence of our electrical infrastructure and transportation infrastructure so that we're cleaner and greener and more sustainable. So looking forward to the discussion tonight.
Great, welcome. Next up, Megan Moore.
Hi everyone, my name is Megan. I am a human geographer and a second-year PhD student at the University of Montana. My work focuses on the intersection of communities and the environment, often in the conservation realm. My master's work looked at the barriers and opportunities for implementing natural water storage, looking at flood irrigation and beaver mimicry as climate adaptation strategies for ranching communities in Southwest Montana. And right now, my current work looks more at social trust and risk perceptions for a community in Southwest Montana that is located in a Superfund site due to historic mining. So I use a variety of different approaches, often political ecology and social psychology, to look at power structures and dynamics with human behavior. So in terms of clean tech, I'm really interested in who and what is using the technology. My definition would be that it is something that uses technology to accomplish different environmental goals, such as clean energy or climate change. For me, a successful clean tech would be that it is incorporating the social justice issues that we are talking about, and that it is also community-based.
Great. Thanks. Thank you very much. Tom, welcome. Thomas Ranken.
Hello, I'm Tom Ranken. I'm the former CEO of the Clean Tech Alliance. I've been quote unquote retired for 10 days now. I'm not sure if I like the word retired yet, but it is what it is. Spent 10 years doing that. We went from being 35 members in 2010 to including our affinity members now to be over 1,000 members around the region as opposed to just in Seattle. And during the course of my career, I've run 2 trade associations. I was an entrepreneur with 2 different businesses, spent time in biotech and also in banking earlier. As for a definition of clean tech, it's pretty darn broad. But to use just a few words to perhaps get to the heart of the matter, I'd say it's doing more with less.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Michele, I want to jump in really quick to make sure people know that you put your questions into chat and we move forward with, after the panel does their discussion, there will be an opportunity to open it up to the audience. So I'll be monitoring the chat and put all your questions there. Thanks, I forgot to say that.
Great, thanks so much, Lori. Okay, so this is to the entire panel. Can you talk about the relevant clean tech policies, applications thereof, and trends as it applies to your particular sector or community?
So Michele, I can start us off, I guess, if that would be helpful. This is Ken. Yeah, so in the energy domain, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, especially numbers 11 and 13, are really relevant in terms of kind of framing the global effort to deal with increased use of renewable energy and sustainable sources. We've seen tremendous policy efforts from governments around the world, particularly in Germany, China, and India, to really focus on aggressive targets for increased renewable energy in the form of clean tech. In the United States, certainly California is leading the way in terms of solar production, but also pretty bold new policies like Rule 21 for a more intelligent electrical grid, and requirements that all new residential construction in the state have rooftop solar. So these are pretty groundbreaking efforts. But renewables are really, they're being embraced around the country. 29 states, the District of Columbia, 3 territories, all have renewable portfolio standards. The most noteworthy being Hawaii, going to 100%, by 2045, I believe. So we're seeing continued movement in their private sector as well towards sustainability as a big part of private equity and sector efforts to really focus on renewable energy and advanced energy technology. And this is all super important because wind and solar have been the fastest growing components of the energy infrastructure, but in the United States, they're still at only about 12%. So that needs to get a lot bigger faster. And so that increasing displacement of fossil fuels is continuing. It's good that we just heard for the first quarter of 2020 that renewables produced about 18% more electricity than coal in the United States. That's noteworthy. In 2016, May 15, 2016, Germany became the first industrialized nation to use entirely renewable sources to power the entire country. So there are these advances that are happening, but they need to really continue.
From the perspective of the Pacific Northwest, a couple things I would mention in terms of policies that I think have been important. As Ken pointed out, the whole area of energy efficiency has been really important for a long period of time. It's part of the culture here. It's part of public policy as well. Great efforts have been made to reduce utilization of energy. We have a long history of having very cheap rates here for electricity. That's partly due to federal policy dating back to the 30s, and hydroelectricity, the great dams that have been built in the region that provide the bulk of the power here in the state, even to this day. We have a program here that's a state level program called the Clean Energy Fund that's been an important part of public policy. It does a number of things, but essentially it's a capital program funding capital acquisitions, both in research and collaborations between utilities and entrepreneurs, things that are designed to get innovation out into the valley of death domain, where there's a lack of dollars to support those kinds of things. Research is incredibly important, not only in the Northwest, but I think all around the nation and the globe. And I'm a big believer that research and innovation are the things that are going to drive things in the future. And we've seen a number of things out here that we think are very important. The whole area of storing power, storing energy is one that's attracted a lot of dollars on the research side and the grant side, universities and so forth, and some entrepreneurial work. Incredibly important to enable technologies like solar and wind to be more effective. In addition, something that's kind of strange and perhaps unexpected, particularly out of the Pacific Northwest, is nuclear technologies have been emerging. Idaho National Labs is probably the nation's, certainly one of the leading areas of research for nuclear, but we have 3 companies in the state that have been focusing on fusion technology, which is always, the joke has always been, is the technology that's 30 years away, but things are starting to happen in that field. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but there's real technology that's being developed, and people are very optimistic, and investors are starting to put money into it as well. So those are the things out here that really look quite interesting.
And when you talk about fusion technology, can you help our audience understand, what that consists of?
Well, it's completely different than standard fission technology. It does require a large capital input to build the facilities. You don't have the nuclear waste problem. In fact, a very small amount of seawater can generate enormous amounts of power through a fusion process. It can be done. It is being done today, but there's still big steps. Essentially on an experimental level, you can accomplish fusion, but it takes more power going in than you get out. So there's still technological issues that need to be worked through. But all around the world, this is being developed, and it's starting to get from the research lab into commercial development now.
Great. So, when Ken spoke about how other countries are making significant advances, and, wind and power are making, wind and solar are making some advances here. This leads me into my next question. So why do you think it takes so long for clean tech startups to get, the investor funding, to get, their design through, thinking about their design through end development, and, to be adopted and be successful?
This is Catherine. I'll take a crack at starting that conversation. I'd love to hear from some of the others. There is money to be had for technology innovation in the venture capital market, in the major kind of institutional investor, or the major institutions that provide funding for companies that are in this space as well. For green startup, I think that the answer to that question is the same answer, or a similar answer, to why we don't have widespread adoption on some of these concepts overall. I think there's an ecosystem that's evolving and understanding and thinking about these things, but it's quickly evolving. And so there are more green venture capital entities that are backing startups in energy, mobility, buildings, materials, and any number of the kind of domains where green technology can actually support that and advance those particular issues. But it's still a relatively small piece of a much broader kind of bucket. I think the other piece, though, is that understanding how to integrate environmental concerns into new product development, and how that actually can add value into the ideation and then the execution of green technology, I think is still actually something that a lot of us are understanding and then learning how to implement. And there are roadmaps for that kind of thing, but it's a matter of making sure that is understood and broadly disseminated and then adopted by people outside of, you know, a cadre of people who are steeped in some of these issues. Sometimes the language can be a little off-putting rather, and sometimes the concepts aren't as widely understood. I think that's changing. I think, you know, with the regulatory or policy environment changing, with some of the trends that we're seeing in the market, well, just in our world around some of these issues and the importance of addressing material efficiency, addressing climate change, and addressing a host of social issues that attend how we actually make and disseminate product. All of those things are rapidly kind of helping people understand the importance of these things and then address them. Yeah. But it's still a relatively small piece of a broader market.
Yeah. I just to add with Catherine, and appreciate the comments. I do find private industry more starting to embrace it. I used to have to run with R&D teams the stage and gate process, where now sustainability is actually a piece of one of the gates to move any project forward now as well too. So it's coming. It's accelerating out there. I think on some of the things in the energy side early on, you know, there's a lot of projects I think Tom brought up as well too. If you talk about fusion and such, these are very capital intensive projects, and the returns on those are very far out in the distance. And so I think if you trace, you know, a lot of VC dollars and such early on in the energy sector, there's a lot of equity lost because of the delays and the type of timelines we're talking about commercialization on that. You know, but I think on the positive side, the awareness is getting stronger. I think you're seeing more VC dollars go into low CapEx solutions, getting into sensor technology, which is getting much more affordable, getting into the data science piece of it, the software that's going to improve operational efficiency and resource management and such as well too. So I think that's accelerating. I think the other part as well too, from the you know, from the venture companies themselves as well, of what I typically run into is making sure they fundamentally understand their customer and the vertical markets they're serving. So if they are in regulated businesses like utilities, do you understand how they buy, how they create value, how you create a value proposition? They used to manage a global business in the utilities industry. It's very, very different than private. Or if you are developing a regulatory based business, understand that can go a lot of different directions, and you have to be intimately involved. Or if you're in food and beverage, do you intimately understand not just the customer, but actually the consumer as well too, and what's going to guide their decisions and drive the particular behavior for those investments?
I'd add a couple of things. One is there are no impulse buys in this field.
Yeah.
You know, things even point. Something in terms, yeah, I'm all big expenses, and even something like an electric car, for example, nobody buys an car just because cool. They buy a new car because they need a new car for some reason. Just don't fly off the shelves. That's true all through this, from everything from, you know, energy generation plants to cars to everything else. Overwhelmingly, these are big ticket items that take time for people to make decisions about. Factor number two is a lot of the owners we talked to over the years have a belief that what they're doing, of course, is the greatest thing since sliced bread, and sometimes it is, but they expect utility customers, and utilities are really terrible customers, not because they're bad people by any means, but they're highly regulated. And we as consumers care about really two things when we comes to our utility bills. We care about keeping the bill, and of course, from a regulatory standpoint, sometimes that's required. And we care about the lights going out. So they have a very low toleration for risk or incremences, and makes it hard to find buyers in many cases. Third, it is just a true statement that there just are not many winners in this space yet. So, you know, venture capitalists are really, at least in the Northwest, a very minor player in all this field. The companies that get funded tend to be funded by angels, or funded by grants from the federal government, and by strategic partners, and they're funded by customers. So it's a different financial picture in terms of investment than certainly the 90s or software or other fields. And all these things just have made it a lot more difficult to get started.
I would agree with Terry and Tom. I think one kind of interesting pattern that's emerging is that as we're seeing in the energy world, more and more digitalization, right? There's actually, I think, some interesting new opportunities that are really best filled by those entrepreneurs, right? That can find ways to bring value to potential customers in using applied technology, and the threshold for entry is not as high as what Tom had just said, right? Because utilities do have a very low risk tolerance. So I think as we see more digitalization, there is an opportunity to see more of that innovation start to happen around how the technology can best be used by energy consumers.
You know, and just to throw an element on the water side as well too. So, you know, so trends are, you know, on a global basis, going to need 30% more water. It's linked with, you know, water energy nexus as well too. So you need energy to produce water, water to produce energy, et cetera. And, you know, 30% is an average number. It doesn't take into consideration, you know, scarcity concerns and such as well too. So there's huge opportunity there. On the other side, you got crumbling infrastructure. You know, some talk about a $1 trillion price tag over the next 10 years to support the infrastructure rebuild just in the North American geography alone. So there's a lot of opportunity out there that can be quantified, can be addressed. I think the digitization part offers just, you know, immense opportunities. So talk, you know, conservation labs, flume, et cetera, that people are doing with leak indication. So approximately 15% of all the water in delivery systems is lost through leaks today. So, you know, what's the solve? And digital applications are key for that. Not just indicating the leak, where the leak is, what's the leak from, and getting after it. And you're starting to see these devices come all the way down to the retail sector as well too. So now there's a sense of empowerment that you can put leak indication in your home, understand if you have a leak through machine learning, AI, et cetera, understand where that leak's coming from, put corrective action in, as an example. So it's coming, and I think it'll accelerate here as we look at the next 5 years.
So Catherine, as you discussed, bringing it back to your circular approach to resources, you know, in the entire value chain, how do we integrate, you know, social systems and this research and the education? So by the time we get, you know, to the end delivery and the launch and the adaptation, you know, all of this has sort of been nurtured and, you know, sort of, you know, kept along the way versus getting to the very end of the delivery and, you know, not knowing about, you know, oh gosh, we had to educate, you know, more and more of these, you know, constituents because they're now going to be partners or suppliers or, you know, end users. Yeah.
Well, the nice thing about circular economy specifically is that we've been doing things that are part of the circular economy for years. We just haven't been using that language. So some of it is actually already built in. It's a matter of learning the nomenclature, learning the language, because the circular economy is really all about disconnecting raw material resource use from economic growth. It is about economic growth. It is about you know, generating profits and sales, and which is what we're all, you know, trying to do as business people. But in trying to disconnect that resource use piece, it's really all about efficiency at its core, and then it's about effectiveness as well. And so there are three major principles of the circular economy. One is about keeping materials in longest productive use. So extending that lifespan through things like refurbishment, remanufacturing, reuse, you know, even dematerialization starts to come into view. You know, then, you know, recycling those resources, and then in the case of materials that might be biological in certain products, making sure that we're actually recommitting those resources and regenerating resources in that process. So it's about sort of creating, you know, a net zero impact on the environment, or even there have been some companies that have been talking about net positive impact when you think about that regenerative piece. So how do companies think about this, or how would an entrepreneur, how would a person just think about integrating something like circularity into their thinking? It starts at the very beginning, and the nice thing is that there's actually a ton of resources on this, and it's about really thinking through in the product design, at the product design phase, who are your customers, what are their uses, and is there a way to think about the materials that you're using to be able to incorporate recycled content or use less materials, use alternative materials, what have you, and then designing that product in such a way that you can actually extend that lifespan of the product or reclaim it at the end for some useful continuous purpose. And we see what happens when companies do that is that they actually find things that they might not have been thinking about. So they find opportunities to think about business as service versus selling a thing. So Philips, big organization, but Philips Lighting did this, now Signify, when they were thinking about pivoting from selling light bulbs to selling lighting. And in the process of doing that, one, you actually embed yourself with your customers over a longer period of time. Two, you actually can use technology to understand better the lifespan of the product that you're creating, and you can continuously enhance that product line. Three, you're reducing the labor expense for your customers, but you're actually enabling or creating kind of an upsell opportunity, or just a continuous sort of customer opportunity by providing lighting versus light bulbs in that particular case. So it can uncover these huge opportunities that you might not have thought about in the business model, in addition to the actual technology itself that you're creating. And we also find that companies, there's been a lot of analysis on the benefits at large for the economy or for the globe around circularity and circular economy initiatives. Companies find actually when they do implement circular economy principles that they actually can identify cost-saving opportunities because you're thinking about using fewer resources, you're thinking about replacing certain resources or materials with others, as well as when you think about this from a kind of an end-to-end perspective in the context of a regulatory environment and just expectations that are ratcheting up around these issues. So certainly legislation, but you also see investors looking at these issues. You see businesses, so the Walmarts of the world, Amazons of the world, they're starting to look for product that actually meets specific environmental criteria. And when you do the math, looking at your opportunities at large, you can see the value better than if you're doing the math on specific sort of material replacement choices at any point in time. So it's really about looking at this from a systems perspective, and it's designing these concepts in at the very beginning, because it's much easier to do that at the very beginning than, as you say, to do it at the end. We find this as a certifier all the time when companies come to us they're seeking certification after they've done all the hard work of creating a product.
Right, right. And Megan, you had mentioned that, and taking off on Catherine's points here, your intersection of community, your focus is intersection of communities and environment and the social trust in addition to the risk. How do you see these social systems being more integrated into clean tech, and where do you see currently there's challenges and risks?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think also the way that you asked the question is interesting in that you're asking how to integrate local communities into clean tech instead of the other way around. I think that a lot of clean tech looks at it as this big, how we're changing these big structural things, either policy or, kind of the entire energy sector. I think that we also need to look at more of the individual and local levels of community acceptance and behavior of these technologies. Something like nuclear, I think, has a lot of potential, obviously, but at the same time, there are still a lot of communities that are very nervous about having a nuclear plant in their community or town. And I think that we often fall into this knowledge deficit of, if we just continue to provide more information to people, they will change their minds. And that's not really how human behavior works, right? If someone keeps telling you to do something, you often become more hardened in your own beliefs, or you go the opposite way, instead of finding a way to connect and learn about how we're going to be changing their behaviors. Or personally, I think the best way would be integrating clean tech into the values that they already have, and providing some ways to have clean tech as this kind of community-based system, where there is communities maybe managing their own solar or managing their own wind, so that they have some buy-in and that they have some power and control over this clean technology instead of it being imparted on them.
Or maybe, Michele, if I could just add, in the energy world, there are estimates that well over 1 billion people around the world have no access to electricity or no access to reliable electricity. So in terms of kind of, you know, unpacking social innovation, giving people the ability to have electric lighting and, you know, cook with electricity rather than having children, you know, collect firewood, that's a huge change in those people's lives. And it's something that I think offers tremendous opportunity as we see clean tech start to offer new opportunities for solar and storage projects in sub-Saharan Africa, or a microgrid in a First Nations location, or, you know, community solar in maybe a economically disadvantaged community in a city. And so I think, to Megan's point, the more we can offer those technologies to be embraced by people and used in a way that meets their values and unlocks new opportunities for them, I think there's tremendous opportunity.
And is there a way to continue to protect the environment without importing these clean technologies? But I mean, initially it's to provide a service or an opportunity and an added value to their day-to-day lives. But is there also a way to be profitable? Because as Catherine said, you know, and I think Terry also remarked, you know, some of these, they're looking at the dollars, and it's not always about the end goal and the good of it versus the profitability.
Ultimately, I think that's a really key point. There's no benefit to reducing carbon unique to where it's saved. That's a global saving. If you save it, you know, a ton of carbon in Seattle, that benefits Chicago just as much as it benefits Washington. So what's important is driving a change all around the globe, and particularly in areas that are growing quickly. So, you know, India, China, sub-Saharan Africa, very important places in terms of growth. And it's important, I should add, that those places grow. I mean, people are well below the poverty level, and in some cases, just abject poverty that's hard for us to imagine. And those are really serious problems. Well, one of the big problems right now is providing electricity to those people today. The the fastest and cheapest way to do that is coal. You know, until there's an alternative that doesn't involve coal, that is truly clean tech, that pencils out to a logical person with a rational mind, we're going to continue to have a problem with it. It's really important, I believe, to continue to innovate, do R&D, and create new technology that pencil out all around the world, not just in the United States.
No, you know, in agreement. I mean, there's a lot of social consequence, you know, getting water out, much like the energy piece of bringing electricity to people around the world as well too. But, you know, but by all means, I think can you have a positive economic impact? Yeah, the answer is yes. So you know, as I look from the water sector, our bigger dilemma typically is water's priced too low versus the cost that it goes to producing water. And so, but that dynamic's going to change as we do infrastructure rebuilds and such, and people pay more attention to water. But you know, the sensor technology, the digital technology is there to optimize water usage, to really reuse water where it's fit for use in different applications. And they, from a circular context of, 100% recycling water. I've seen paper mills who completely close up, who basically have a process that's 99.5% water and able to go through purification and 100% recycle that water as well too. I think the other dynamic that's happening now as well too is we've done a lot of work in the food and beverage and consumer side as well, is the newer generations, the millennials, now emerging Gen Zs and such as well too, will start to pay a little bit of a premium, not a lot, but a little bit of a premium, on environmentally friendly products as well too. And that's a different dynamic. I used to do a lot of work with the P&Gs in the world and such. They said, great, if you can bring me something green, as long as it's at the same or lower price, I'll be happy with it. But I think those dynamics are starting to see where awareness, people are more aware of the environment, the impacts that they make, and will pay a little bit more right now as well too. And that's a different dynamic than it existed 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's particularly true with a lot of large corporations that fear not having a positive brand. Their employees care, their investors care, their consumers care. So, being able to foster that brand and do real things that convince people that they care and they're doing things that are important is increasingly a factor driving some of this.
I would agree. And Megan, just to circle back once more, you had mentioned that you had done some master's work on with ranchers, and and looking at the sensor technology or digital opportunities, reuse of water. Did you find that in your research?
Did I find what in my research?
When you said you were doing some master's work.
Sure.
And you said you were talking to people about efficiency of water on these ranches. Were they using sensor technology or digitalization or use of water? Did you find these other tools and techniques, or?
So, as most of you probably know, Montana is in the arid West, and so ranching is not really that profitable to begin with. Mm-hmm. And flood irrigation, which is literally flooding your field and then moving ditches every day, has been the technique for a long time. And then pivot and other types of sprinkler irrigation came around in the 70s because of grants by the NRCS and other government-funded grants, based mostly on the principle of efficiency in that you are using less water. What ended up happening, however, is that a lot of aquifers and late season flows in a lot of the rivers where people are pulling water from have started to decline, partly because of droughts and because of how our precipitation is changing, depending on the season. But we have found, or they have found, that, efficiency is always not the end goal or the best goal, because pivots use or only saturate kind of the first 5 inches of the soil, while when you're flood irrigating, you are replenishing the aquifer and all of the groundwater. However, for a lot of ranchers that are in Montana, most of them are over the age of 50, and they are now able to use a cell phone app that turns their pivot on and off, which, is a lot easier, and I think all of us would choose to do, instead of standing outside for 12 hours shoveling ditches and moving them, standing in 3 feet of water covered by mosquitoes. So I'm not sure, I don't really think I would consider irrigation to be a clean technology. I would say that it is a struggle with technology in terms of how we move forward in the future in the face of climate change, and making something that is efficient but also keeps us out of a reoccurring cycle of drought if we are not replenishing aquifers and groundwater.
Okay, yikes. All right, we're going to move on to the next question, which is around jobs. We mentioned there's, a whole value chain that's involved in clean tech. So Tom, since your specialization is in jobs and, futuring these careers in this space, how would you categorize the current state of opportunities in clean tech, and how are businesses supporting and enabling that future expansion, given what, you know, our goals are and where we need to be?
Well, it's a really, really broad area.
It is.
You know, we see, you know, some of ours, of course, are verticals. So, you know, there are companies, for example, that are working on fusion or digesters, and, you know, even the utilities, those are, you know, clearly verticals in this space that, you know, everybody that looked at those companies would say, yes, these are companies that are involved somehow in clean tech. But, you know, everybody is involved in clean tech in one way or another. For example, the largest member of the Clean Tech Alliance is Boeing, right? Nobody would describe Boeing as a clean tech company. It's an aerospace company, but they are very, very interested in things like energy efficient airplanes. They're very interested in fuel economy. They're very interested in biofuels. It gets pretty deep within the company. They've made a, you know, very deep commitment to doing those kinds of things. That's true. You see it, you know, Amazon, Microsoft, you know, really extraordinary things happening within those companies. So from a standpoint of jobs, I don't know if you can limit yourself to a specific subsector, saying if you're interested in this, you need to study solar power, for example. That's just not the case.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question, or is that in the right direction?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just coming from in cybersecurity, you know, they predict 3.2 million jobs to be, you know, empty by the beginning of 2021. And so I wanted to parallel that to this sector and sort of get a perspective. Are we keeping up with it? Are we offering education? Are we offering, you know, scholarships for research? You know, maybe, I know it's a very broad question, but just trying to see if
it's difficult to say, because this sector, unlike most others, spans so many different fields.
It does.
So, you know, in general, I think the answer is yes. People are very interested in these questions, and they're making investments both on, you know, at Boeing and with entrepreneurs and so forth.
Yeah.
But
It just,
you know, I have a great deal of skepticism about, you know, the studies you see that there are X number of jobs in this field and they're expanding to X times 75. Just because every study has a different definition. I think all of them show a lot of growth and expansion, but it's usually apples and oranges that they're being compared.
yeah. And just to go along with Tom's comments, just from the water side, look, we deal in every vertical imaginable around the world. And I will say that you are seeing the cultural change, that people are embracing it, whether it's a brand equity piece, whether it's purely economics. And so the jobs associated with that, they may not be in standalone companies looking at just water or energy, but I think are applicable a fairly broad spectrum of industries.
And then moving on to investors and entrepreneurs, educational research, business, government. How do all these players become partners to become less reactive? Because I feel like we're in a very reactive mode right now, and become more proactive to, you know, go through the value chain that, you know, Catherine has shared with us, to ensure, you know, a successful, adoptable process, you know, system, community, et cetera. What do you think we can do, or what do you think needs to be done to help that be more integrated and partnerish versus, you know, sort of silos the way it is today?
I think that's a really, go ahead.
Thomas, one point, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, so I'll say it very briefly. I want to go back to something Ken started with, and that's the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which I think probably many of us are familiar with them, but just to a level set, because there's so many acronyms in the world, the UN, you know, is the body that we governments go to set agendas and aspirational targets around a host of things, and sustainability and sustainable development has been the topic of conversation for years. And over the course of many years, there's been sort of an evolution of thinking and how that manifests. And the most recent manifestation of that body of thinking and knowledge and aspiration is embodied in what's called the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which are 17 goals to change the world. And they're really pretty, and they're really attractive, and they're very compelling. And at the top level, the tiles, you'd be hard pressed to disagree with any of them. And then you get into the 169 targets underneath them and the indicators beyond that, and that's where the hard work is. These are really targeted at governments and what they're trying to achieve in terms of, what do they exist for? They exist to serve the people in their domains and in their localities. But businesses have a role to play in that, a really important role to play in that. And so the goal 17, which is about partnerships, I think is both aspirational and it's motivating in helping many entities that previously were very siloed and still are very siloed start to break down those silos and have conversations. I've seen it in the work that we do in circular economy. So you mentioned investors, you mentioned governmental entities, and there are others. UL, engages in, we go to a lot of different conferences, but there's one organization, GreenBiz, that we've engaged with before. They have an event in February that kind of brings people together on this. And they brought investors, and they brought manufacturers, and they brought product designers, and others of us in this value chain together to actually talk about some of these issues. And I feel really excited about that. But Tom, back to you. I mean, I'd love to hear what you're thinking about this, because this is what we need to talk about, and this is what we need to continue to work on, in my view.
Well, I over the course of the last few months, read a book called Bowling Alone by a guy named Robert Putnam at Harvard. Have you read it? It's about the virtual devastation of social infrastructure in America. And, just getting people in the same room with common interests talking about what they're doing is incredibly important. We see that with the Clean Tech Alliance. That's a big part of what our mission is to be a platform to have people talk to each other. People find jobs, they find investors, they find customers, they find collaborators, they find research. It's just really important on, just on the basic human level to have those kinds of systems out there. And there really aren't that many in clean tech. And when I was in biotech, there was a state trade association in every state pretty much. That's not true in clean tech. There are different kinds of organizations, and there's really not much of a network between them. So, I mean, all of these things are important. What you're talking about is important, certainly, but creating those infrastructures where people just have the chance to share ideas is a big part of getting things done, so you can create efficiencies and synergies between different ideas and concepts.
Yeah. And Michele, and just go along with that, because when on the water side, especially in the public sector, it really is management by crisis. And you just see it too often in terms of water scarcity issues. A few years ago in California, we were scrambling to work with the government there, try and find incentives for people to put in, more efficient uses of water, recycling, such. And then the drought goes away and the problem goes away, and they move on to the next priority. Health issues in water the same way. Flint, Michigan is not an island in terms of lead delivery systems and what can cause from a health perspective as well too. And so I think, and you run the private sector as well too. I was doing some work one time, the company who have water issues, scarcity issues with their biggest ice cream plant they have in the country. It's in Las Vegas. So strategically, why did you put that plant in Las Vegas? And so I think holistically, this element of strategic planning, of public-private sector working together on infrastructure issues. I'll tell you on the water side, I bet there are very few people on this panel even know what the composition of their water is they drink every day and bathe in every day. And I'd suggest getting it checked, because the municipality is not what you're ingesting. And so we got to tackle these bigger issues and get after them, because it's when these crises happen, they're pretty severe in the cases of shutting down plants or putting the health of thousands of people in harm's way in places like Flint, Michigan.
Yeah, I just add maybe that I think these types of dialogues are incredibly important, right? To make sure that we have the different perspectives introduced. I think there's some really interesting convergences that are happening, at least in the energy world, where, you know, electric vehicles there's nearly 6 billion on the roads now. They're kind of becoming an energy storage system that you can drive, right? And so there's this convergence of the transportation fleet and the energy infrastructure. We're seeing convergence of the physical world and the digital world, right? In a lot of different ways. We're seeing convergence of the manufacturing industry with, you know, the circularity expertise that Catherine and others bring. So having that convergence where we're thinking about things in different ways, and maybe more holistically managing what we're doing with those resources entirely from inception to the end of life, I think is really interesting. And it does require people to step outside of their bubbles and, you know, why does that happen? Well, it maybe happens because there is a research grant, and U.S. Department of Energy, I think, has done a really good job of making funds available to explore some of these things. The academic world, I think, has really stepped in and you know, found some interesting places where there's a nexus and there is some work to be done by bringing these different perspectives to bear. But the industry is doing it increasingly, and I think it has to continue.
I agree. The partnership across private sector, you know, environmental investors, entrepreneurs, I think that all will make a difference. And, you know, look at the panel today. They're broadly spanning all those groups and, you know, to advance the solutions in this area. What was I just going to say? Terry, you were saying that if the people got their water tested, you know, they should know what they're bathing in. What do you think they would do?
Well, no, but you know, so look, no, there are solutions. You know, I've always been convicted that there's not a lack of water, there's a lack of common sense. The technology exists, and there's more technology being developed all the time, but we do need to increase awareness. And so like Mazarine, for example, we've invested in a company called Simple Labs, Simple Water, who provides, you know, a network of 70 labs around the country to get their water tested. And they actually are building up data science databases where you're going to develop tap scores for every zip code, every block in the country, much as you'd go on Zillow and get walkable scores. You get a tap score of that water quality. And when you get your water tested, if you've got high lead content, arsenic, etc., there's provided solutions to how you get those corrected to handle the particular health situation. There are 40 million people in the country who are in well water, you know, and it's so critical. There might be outbreaks, and this getting into data science and the health aspects of water as well too, where maybe there's higher incidences of cancer in a particular geography and such. And if we have this data science relative to water quality, we're able to jump on that quicker and amend and make the appropriate changes. So there's a piece of this and this is the piece about getting these tools out to the consumer on leak detection, on water testing, which actually starts empowering everybody on this call and then allowing them to put the actions in place, as opposed to having to wait for your municipality or government to act.
Good point. Yeah, I use a Berkey. I was turned on to a Berkey by family members, and that's the kind of water I drink, where, you know, I'm sure the water here is just great. but
it's good. But even think of the context of the billions of dollars that are spent on bottled water that aren't necessary. You know, putting the right, if you improve water quality at home, ultrafiltration, ROI, and exchange systems, you can produce the same, put it in your reusable water bottle, and we've just eliminated that much waste out in the environment.
Right. Someone once told me purchased water in plastic water bottles is really just tap water.
Yeah, it is essentially.
Okay, so we have one more question, and then we have some questions in the chat we're going to move to. But why the heck should we continue to care and be passionate about clean tech? And what guidance or, actionable items do you have for our audience for them to be able to enable clean tech in their day-to-day lives, their businesses, their communities, and be a voice in clean tech to start moving the needle a little faster than we're doing it now? So think about that for a minute. And Terry, if you want to start, we'll go through the entire panel then.
Yeah, so so first of all, you can practice what you preach out there, obviously, and set an example. But I always, and one of the things I coach my children in as well too, is you've got the strongest vote out there in terms of how private companies move, and that's where you spend your dollar. And so if you start making environmentally conscious purchases out there, you want to see people pivot and move quickly, they'll move very, very quickly. And I think you're seeing this with people worried about brand equity. You're seeing things, change in terms of prepared foods and such out in the environment. And so my biggest piece, change consumption patterns, and things will change very, very rapidly in terms of private industry. And then the other part is just, increasing awareness that we have finite resources out there, and, managing them better has got economic consequence and it's got health consequence on all of us.
Good points. Thank you. Megan, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we're going to solve climate change without a lot of these things, and especially in clean tech. I think bringing a lot of the clean tech to the local level is something that I think is really important in terms of asking communities what they need and figuring out solutions and collaboration with them, I think is a big thing, and especially using the resources that they have or kind of innovating from what they already do, I think is a great way to kind of move forward, especially in climate change issues.
Great, thank you. Catherine?
Sure, I concur with the imperative around the issues we're facing. It's not so existential crisis of climate change, because already more than 10% of the Earth's surface has exceeded that 2% or 2 degree threshold that used to be the threshold we didn't want to exceed. It's now 1.5, right? So and this is affecting some communities more than others already. But I'd like to actually emphasize the business imperative, like the economic drivers that are ratcheting up. They're already in place, and they're only going to become increasingly more vocal and compelling. So big news at the beginning of this year, Larry Fink, BlackRock CEO, sent a letter to the CEOs of the companies they held stock in saying, we told you a year ago we were going to start looking at climate change and these other sustainability issues. We're going to do that now. And in fact, what we're doing is we're going to specifically start voting against management and boards that aren't taking action on these issues. And we're going to start divesting of companies that aren't taking action in these issues. There is credit. The whole financial sort of infrastructure, credit ratings that correspond with how companies perform on these climate specifically, because that's so measurable and quantifiable in ways that some other issues aren't yet in the same way across, when you think about what investors are doing, they're trying to get this across a portfolio. But that ecosystem is getting more and more engaged on these. It is still the investors that are looking at environment, social governance information is still relatively small given the market overall, but it has grown tremendously and the projections indicate that that's going to continue. At the same time, Walmart's Project Gigaton, they are actually requiring their suppliers to report against these issues and a host of other sustainability issues. In fact, they made a commitment a couple of years back to source 70% from suppliers that were meeting their sustainability objectives, and they were going to start preferentially purchasing from those and deselecting out suppliers who weren't able to meet those objectives, and that's only getting more and more rigorous. Other retailers as well. Regulatory environment, we see circularity laws coming into effect with starting out as guidelines and like, please do this, and then becoming more rigorous with enforcement, including penalties in the EU, in China, and in other jurisdictions around the world. So it would be folly to not pay attention to these things, particularly if you aspire ever to, IPO or, sell into some of these big marketplaces. But there's also a lot of money on the table. So I think there's a driver, a compelling carrot and stick to pay attention to these issues and take action.
I agree. JP Morgan Chase issued a similar kind of report to Larry Fink saying, the companies that they're going to do business with must be environmentally, socially, and government, deploying this governance within their communities. I don't know how they're going to test for all that. Yes, you can go to the board meetings, you can be on the board. It'll be interesting how BlackRock's going to actually test for that. Yeah,
they're requiring companies to actually provide them the data. So I'll just leave everybody with SASB, Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, is an organization that BlackRock, Bloomberg, State Street Global Advisors, and others are pointing to and saying these are the requirements for what are financially material in reporting to us, the investors, your ESG, environment, social governance data. 77 standards exist today. Take a look at those. They're freely available for download. Those are the baseline requirements that everybody's going to be held accountable to. But there's Global Reporting Initiative. There are other frameworks that that have been around for a while that are worth paying attention to, and good resources to help your roadmap.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. Who's next? Ken? Or Tom, go ahead.
Do I go, Tom?
Okay, so
Yeah.
so you asked why should we care about clean tech primarily? I think the answers are two: climate and innovation in the economy. We spend 6% of our national GDP on energy. We can cut that back and create solutions and innovations that build the economy. It's great for everybody. How do we get there? I'm a big believer in R&D and innovation, and so is all of America. I think according to the Yale data, the district in which the support for clean energy research is the least is about 75% of people support it. There's overwhelming support by the American people for energy research and all research of all sorts. That, supported by public policy, I think is going to move the needle in the long run.
Great, thank you. Ken?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. So why should we care about clean tech? Well, the planet and its people demand a different approach, right? So how are we going to get there? You can change behaviors, but it's really, really hard, right? As Megan had stated earlier. You can impose a new economic paradigm that oftentimes is very hard. So what's our main hope? It's clean tech, right? That's our special sauce for accomplishing some of these things in a way that actually aligns us with a more sustainable society. And so, I want to go back to something Tom mentioned earlier, and unpack it a little bit. It's really important. Right now, about half of the world's people live in cities. By the year 2050, that will be somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the world's people. And many of those cities are places that we aren't necessarily thinking of as population centers today. You overlay that with the concept that buildings contribute about 75% of a city's carbon emissions. The built environment is incredibly important, and in the next 40 years, we will entirely rebuild everything that's on the face of the earth today. And so if we do it right, by using clean tech, we've unlocked a more sustainable future, but we have to do it. So how do we get there? We need research, right? We need innovation. We need cross-functional partnerships to find new ways to do this. And every bit makes a difference. And I think that all the people who are probably on this session probably care about it, right? And so maybe we're preaching to the choir to a certain degree, but it is so important for us to continue to demand this type of collaboration to push to a more sustainable future.
Great feedback from this entire panel, and thank you so much. We do have some questions now that Lori's going to pull from the chat box.
Yep.
And
Here I am.
There you go.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I just want to say from to Megan's point and others around personal values, I, for instance, buy Patagonia because of their commitment to, material traceability. They have that worn wear project where extending the use of your 9 months longer of your coat and what it does for the climate and the environment. So I do align my purchasing decisions with looking into these things. And so having more information about companies that align with that sort of thing would be an easy place to go for that. Maybe that's UL, I don't know, but I would like to find out about that. So let's start with, I'm going to go down the list of questions. Simona, if you're still here, I don't see her. So I'm going to ask her question because the recording will be available. And she was the young woman from the University of Illinois Agricultural Engineering program. And she wanted to know everyone's opinion on using energy for tasks such as desalination. Anyone?
Yeah, Tom or Terry might have a viewpoint. I mean, certainly desalination is super energy intensive, right? So it's not great from an energy standpoint, and generally it's not good for the water either, right? Because you increase the salinity of the remaining water. So I think there's some challenges to that. In very specialized niche type applications, it makes sense, but there are some challenges. Tom or Terry?
No, it's the same way. I mean, here's another area for opportunity. Thermal desalination is very, very energy intensive. You do find the largest plants in the world in the Middle East. You have scarcity of water, but you have a very, very cheap energy supply. Regretfully, it's in fossil fuels there as an example. But again, it's another opportunity. They've got more desal going in here down in Florida. More being scoped out in California as well too. But definitely would an opportunity to look at in terms of decreasing the energy intensity of the systems.
Great, thank you. David LaRue, you want to unmute? I can unmute you, can't I?
I got it.
You got it. So you had, I think, maybe even a couple questions. So go ahead.
So we started talking about fusion, fission and fusion as far as nuclear energy. And I think Gates has got some new project going on, uses depleted uranium, wanted to go test it, which is, obviously we got a whole bunch of depleted uranium in storage. And so it would be potentially a good way to leverage a waste product in order to generate energy. So, and I think it's relatively safe. Any thoughts on that?
Well, nothing beyond just that there are a number of different technologies or
restrictions.
Yeah, there are a number of different technologies, including TerraPower, which I think you're referring to. They're being developed at small modular nuclear and so forth. Right. That we'll see how they work out over time. That's my mantra: is invest on all these things and let the market ultimately determine if they work or not. But the technologies seem promising, and the companies have made great progress.
But to your point before about investment, it looks like Gates is the only one investing, and potentially China, right? But there's there isn't the U.S. Energy Department investing, I don't think, in his solution. Why not?
I don't know. Bezos is putting a lot of money for fusion technologies here. The Allen family is putting money for other one. money going in. I know under the current administration, there's more in funding research, for example, at Idaho Labs, where new, big items. So
Yep.
That's an issue that we're into. Sorry, I don't have the direct.
That's all right. Yeah. And the second question is, there's some, university and public and government partnerships. There's one with Colorado School of Mines, with Renewable Energy Laboratory, and there's a couple of other ones that they're doing there also. That seems to be paying off, right? I mean, it goes across their discipline, what they do, both from an energy and mining perspective, and then that is potentially leveraged into business and the government. But how do we take that model and potentially replicate that across the country, and then potentially then push it down? Because I did some time at DeVry, and one of the problems that we had from a technology perspective was we didn't get any support from the school for actually trying to do these public partnerships with companies like Salesforce or anything like that, because they're constrained about how many people you actually moved into those jobs when you graduated. So it was sort of the chicken and the egg problem. We're kind of got metrics on did we place somebody in a particular job, when what you need to do is before they can get there, you need to train the people before you can put them in the job. Does that make sense? We sort of have a chicken and the egg problem.
So are you referring to the technology transfer problem, universities and commercialization?
So a lot of schools don't have programs in technology, in advanced technology, or technology that's advancing, let's say in IoT or cloud technology or these energy areas, because the schools are graded and effectively whether they place people in these into these areas. Okay, so they're reluctant to actually have the courses.
So it's a problem with the rating of the schools for admissions, that kind of issue.
Right. And so we're kind of we're driving the wrong kind of behavior. In other words, if we want more people to do renewable energy, we probably need to have more programs and then push it farther into the programs all the way down to potentially the vocational schools. But we don't. These are at the graduate level and Ph.D. level, which is very few people.
Yeah, so I'll say your point is absolutely valid, and that kind of nurturing of the next generation of solution providers is absolutely critical. I think there are a lot of those robust, I do quite a bit of work with Merrill, and have worked with some of those talented scientists from the Colorado School of Mines, and there's some really great stuff happening there. Stanford works in the same way with SLAC.
Mm-hmm.
I'm on the advisory board for the Duramat Consortium, and there's quite a bit of funding to support postdoc work. Right. So I think, and a lot of that funding ultimately comes from the U.S. Department of Energy. And so it's being meted out in, I think, a wide variety of ways to support those partnerships. I'm leading a series of projects on photovoltaic reliability right now. We're supporting scientists at Case Western Reserve University getting their PhDs. So there's a lot of those types of things that are happening. And so I think the demand is there, and I think perhaps we can always do more, but I think there are some really good things happening with that research institution, academic institution, industry partnership.
I think the students care about it too. If they see, schools being really innovative and pushing things out that will change things, that makes a big difference to them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. I think the bigger dilemma is just, again, attracting more students into STEM curriculums and engineering curriculums. I'm working in the city of Chicago right now at the Black Society Engineers, another group, MOCA, of really doing grassroots work of getting the students involved at much, much earlier ages and making sure they're prepared for these particular careers. So I think there's more of a void here in terms, there's lots of opportunities. I think the grants are out there and such. We don't have the people necessarily grabbing the lead to go ahead and take advantage of it.
Good. John Matuzek, are you still, there you are. If you could unmute yourself.
I am unmuted, I think.
Yes, you are.
Can you hear me okay?
I can.
So to provide some context, I am largely ignorant of your sector, apart from what I read in the popular press and what I've learned today. So I don't have strong opinions in either direction. My first question revolves around, are there systemic challenges to getting energy distributors? And I'm thinking of my local, I live in Downers Grove, Illinois, just east of Naperville, and or the Hub 88 headquarters. And I think of ComEd as my electricity distributor, and which they've been for many years, but I'm aware that they're actually not much of an electricity generator. They're really a distributor. And so a question in my mind becomes, are these distributors themselves across America and perhaps across the world averse to working with renewable suppliers if those suppliers are relatively cost effective vis-a-vis the current market rate? So is part of the challenge persuading a ComEd to forego or to take on a different group of suppliers who are using non-renewable generation, abilities, as opposed to suppliers who are using renewables? So is that part of the problem? So that'd be my first question. Is anybody enlighten me about that?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at that. It's a really important question. I think there has been significant uptake of renewable technologies by utilities across the country. Some of it's influenced by those state renewable portfolio standards that are being defined. Some of it's enforced by the state commissions or the other oversight bodies that will direct kind of what's going on. But the utilities see the business sense in this, right? Solar and wind actually can be cost competitive with some of the other technologies. And so I think you're seeing an increasing approach of embracing those technologies in a defined role. They do present some challenges for utilities, right? Because the grid has to balance at all times. And so there's the duck curve is the famous reference about what's happened in California. As you put more and more solar in and you put more storage in, or if you don't put more storage in, you see this really sharp demand at the end of the day where the sun's going down, you're losing the solar production, you still have commercial and industrial loads, and you're starting to get residential loads go up quickly. And so it's really hard for the utilities to meet that instantaneous balancing. But there's technologies like energy storage that are helping to address that, right? And smart inverters and other technologies that are all part of clean tech that are helping to say, we can do both. We can make those both work. And so I think more and more you're seeing it happen. Even Florida, which has traditionally really resisted solar on any kind of large scale, is now in on embracing solar. So I think you'll see it happen more and more as we go forward, just because the economics and those other kind of soft conditions all kind of come together more and more as we go forward.
Okay, fair enough. And Ms. Piazza, should I proceed with my second question or wait for someone else on the list?
No, you go ahead, Jen.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think it was Ms. Swanson mentioned consumer preference and choosing sort of eco-friendly or renewable friendly products, which is a fine idea and one within reach for many of us, being likely all relatively well situated financially, people who don't have to live hand to mouth or day to day. But there's a considerable number of people, and the far greater majority, very likely across the globe and perhaps even in North America, who simply don't have that luxury. So somewhere along the way, the apparent fact that large swaths of the globe still suffer from inadequate electricity at an absolute scale, or perhaps relatively inconsistent electricity production. So presuming that to be the case, would it not make sense for the clean sector in general, in some sort of consortium, alliance, whatever arrangement could be readily made, to take on one of those regions, presumably in a relatively small geography to make it more feasible or practical, and attempt to install the requisite infrastructure on that smaller scale and bring in renewables sources at that smaller scale and sort of test the concept and prove the concept, which would have, I think, great positive or salutary effects for the industry as a whole, but would also have the immediate and most beneficial aspect or consequence of making life a lot better for those folks who lack electricity on a daily basis. So again, I don't know if that's feasible or practical in any way. It's just an idea I thought of. And then finally, Mr. LaRue mentioned, I think, the disincentives that he experienced at DeVry. Now, my own experience as a business person is that incentives almost always have perverse consequences. And understanding those perverse consequences and their extent is very, very difficult. But you wind up with them, whether it's for a salesman's compensation, whether it's for trying to get more productivity out of your staff, whatever it might be, there's some aspect of those incentives which often run you off the rails and create more problems than the original incentive would have accomplished. So, but there are some incentives that we know to be effective, namely marketplace incentives. So to the extent that I, the consumer of electricity, or my company, which is again a consumer of energy, benefits from renewable resources, we're incented to choose them to the extent we're able to choose them. And so if the industry collectively is waiting for the UN or some other international body to come rescue us, or the fervor of the climate change folks to raise awareness and adoption and again sort of come to the rescue, I'm skeptical that those forces, those external agents, will do the job. It seems to me that the only way the job will get done is if you all collectively are able to innovate to such an extent that we're all incented, whether we be Exxon or me or the man on the moon someday, we're incented to choose your option because it's simply the better option. And it makes more sense economically, and it makes more sense in every way. But relying on consumer sentiment or some virtue that we collect from being more ecologically sensitive, I fear that will not get you where you want to be. It might work well in North America or pockets of North America. Will it work well globally? Doesn't seem to be working in China, despite some of what I heard. Doesn't seem to be working in India, despite some of what I heard. And those are just two of the current countries which, from what I understand, are driving the relative level of energy misuse in the world today. Does that make sense?
Well, I think I agree with what you said. And when innovation is developed that is better, faster, cheaper, cleaner, and safer, and the rational, logical decision is to build, for example, solar, wind, and storage because it is better, faster, cheaper, cleaner, and safer than coal in India or any other place around the world, then you've really changed the world. And that should be the goal of innovation and research and development and ultimately the economy, I believe.
Yeah, just got to continue to fuel the innovation. At the end of the day, it's economics that's really going to drive the cart as fast as possible.
Yeah. And I think that, go ahead.
Go ahead, Mr. Boyce.
I was going to say, I think there is a good success story in terms of wind and solar. You know, you look at solar panels, that their prices drop 90% in 10 years, right? That's because of that research that we've all been talking about that really drove better performing products. And so, you know, that's a great story, right? Because it does allow you to start to say it's economically viable. And so now you can start to ease back on some of those government-based incentives and let the market move forward, right? But I think you need a mix, right? Because you do need to have, especially in some of these more challenging environments, like sub-Saharan Africa, you need to have some support to have these things occur at all, right? Because the funding just won't happen. And so that's where U.S. aid and I mean, I've been at a number of events to support energy technologies in Southern Africa that were sponsored by U.S. aid. Those are great events, right? Because they highlight U.S. technology. They kind of turn people on to the art of the possible. And they also help the people that are living in these very challenging conditions, right? And so when you have those things happen, you can start to catalyze some of the things that you're talking about, which are very important.
Great.
Finally, for Mr. TG from Mazarine, we have a common friend in Mark Kovsek from Conservation Labs.
Yeah.
He's a former colleague of mine and is doing a lot to help me launch my own startup. So I just spoke with him yesterday.
Outstanding. If I can ever be of assistance, feel free to give me a ring as well too, Jen.
Great, thank you.
Wonderful. So we've got a couple more questions. I want to, Megan, I want to go to your significant question. She has a question to the board, and I think Ken and Mark Hinch are here, and probably Phil, with regards to steps and measures that the Hub 88 board is taking to promote inclusion and diversity within the group, and certain commitments. What commitments do we have that are being taken to support Black, Indigenous, people of color? Both individually, I believe you were asking about, as well as for startups and businesses. So wonderful question, given everything that's going on. Everyone individually and leaders of organizations need to be looking at this. And so I throw it back to the board if someone wants to step in and.
Yeah, Lori, I'll make a couple of
Thanks,
comments about it. Thank you, Megan, for the question. Just I want to interject too. First, thank you to all the panelists from Hub 88's standpoint. Just I'll do so I don't have to come back to a wrap. Thank you to the panelists and to the participants. It's been a great discussion so far. Megan, to your point, you know, Hub 88 is we're kind of geographically along the I-88 corridor in the suburbs of the Chicago area. We have kind of started as a kind of a tighter, very, you know, close to tight community within the suburbs we were in, and we've been kind of growing. The events and the participants, we have about 800 people have come through, more than 800 who've been part of our community of coming to our events, our members, part of our advisory board, and so that group has grown, and we've kind of, I think, represented fairly well to this point kind of the demographics of our region we focused on. More recently, but through one thing we have emphasized from the board's perspective and from just what our advisors in our community expects is an emphasis on women in technology and their contributions. We've been given a lot of visibility and gotten some phenomenal speakers and panelists and in the TechTalk panels that we've had over the years, and we've continued to be very supportive of those efforts. And a lot of our advisory leaders and women like Lori and Michele and many others that have been really part of our kind of advancement as a not-for-profit have been women and making a lot of contributions to those efforts. In terms of people of color, well, we are now expanding sort of some of our partnerships with other organizations in the greater Chicago region. So we now have some partnerships with the city, some other groups in the city of Chicago, entrepreneurship groups. We have a strong relationship with one of the smart city initiatives in the city of Aurora, which is the town next door to Naperville, that has a extremely diverse and a very strong representation of people of color, and our outreach there is intended to have Hub 88 serve those communities as well, the Aurora community, the small businesses and the that are growing out of that their entrepreneurship support efforts. And we have just made a connection with Black Women in Business group that's out in this area. So it's not maybe a specific plans that you might be looking for, but we have really are fighting our mission to help technology. One thing I'll say is that we feel like entrepreneurship, which is one of our main areas of emphasis with working with companies, is an empowering phenomenon. And so we kind of welcoming companies and young companies with people of all diverse backgrounds to help them start their companies, become more successful economically, and we know that'll have a bigger impact on everyone's equality and success. Is that helpful?
Yes, thanks, Phil. And we can come back to that if other people have any other questions around that. Otherwise, just put it in the chat and I'll come back to you. But let's move on to Chuck Byers, because I know he had a question around some sustainability efforts. Are you here, Chuck? Great, I see you. Go for it.
Yes. I hope it's not too political a question. It's not intended to be divisive in any event. It's really about how sustainability initiatives can succeed without substantial from the top government involvement. We're not seeing that with climate change deniers in the White House and so forth in this country. And we've seen rather similar behavior in many of the other industrialized countries who are not doing their part for sustainability and saving the planet. So the question is there a mechanism through which grassroots can sort of short circuit the potential lack of foresightedness in the government and just get the job done? And what are the limits of the ability of grassroots movements to do so?
Well, a couple of thoughts come to mind. One is we work with the Canadian consulate in Seattle quite a bit, and their whole policy changed substantially around 2012. And we heard the concept of subnational governments, which basically means they realize the federal government is no longer going to do anything compared to the prior administration, but the states and municipalities really do care, and they are moving the needle. So that's part of the answer. It's, if it was federal leadership, certainly there would be more things that were happening, no doubt about that. But that doesn't mean that our state governments and local governments aren't doing stuff that's pretty substantial. The other thing I would say is I think there's been a substantial change that I've observed over the last 10 years in people's attitude about this. I'm not sure there are very many climate deniers anymore. There are people that don't think that's as important and may have differences in terms of what public policy is appropriate to take. But the notion that climate was not changing was, I think, pretty common 10 years ago. I don't think it's very common anymore. I think that's just part of what we've come to agree, at pretty much all levels. That's my 2 bits.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say, one of the nice things that can happen is when there is support for innovation through research grants. Not just one country necessarily benefits from that. Everybody can benefit when the needle is moved. And I think we've seen that happen in the energy space. Surprisingly, Department of Energy, they've refocused a little bit, as agencies do when the administration changes, but there's still a very strong focus on funding and executing innovation in renewables. And so the story may not be as bleak there, I would say, as people may think it is. And certainly we have kind of the lifetime scientists that continue the work that they've been doing at DOE and in the national laboratories and in the academic sector and in industry, right? So I think there's still some really good things happening there. I do think the point about about local governments, having an impact. It matters, right? You look at what's happening in California. Again, when they put in the mandate to require all inverters that are installed in the state to be smart inverters, right, that can support the grid, actively support the grid, we helped lay out those requirements, but then the requirements were in place, right? So the utilities and the regulators and the industry all agreed this is what a smart inverter can do, and this is how we'll use it in the infrastructure. Everybody benefited from that, right? So Hawaii and Arizona and Illinois is looking at it. There's that technology now is being used and implemented in much the same way because California took the effort to kind of lead the way on that. And so I think those kinds of synergies really are not insignificant, and we should really value them. But I also think the point about grassroots is important, right? I mean, we're all informed people and we all care about the future, I think, right? That's why we're here.
Yeah.
And so thinking about enabling those grassroots efforts like community solar is one of the really exciting things, I think, in the energy world that distributed energy resources and storage offer, because now you can start to localize what you're doing if you have the will.
Yeah, no, and I just, concur along that. Look, it's all about the grassroots start of things. I mean, if you want to try and take a top-down approach on any of these, it's not going to happen. And so you do see these bottom-up approaches. Just here in Naperville, where we've had a lot of exposure, I would say Steve Chirico was one of the first people, even though we've been in Naperville since 1974, one of the first folks to come over to the facility, see what we do, see Water University. And, lo and behold, he's implementing Water 2.0 in Naperville, putting smart water meters in every house. You're going to be able to remotely monitor your water usage. It's got leak indication capabilities. And so once these things happen from the grassroots standpoint, it's a little bit like you're talking about with California. Now you have a case study. You can elevate, the savings, the economics, the environmental, sustainability case study out there. And guess what? It expands. And it's really from a U.S. perspective, it's the way this country was built. And so, not to get out there in quotes, but, it's the Dr. King quote, if I can't do great things, maybe I can do small things in a great way. And I think fundamentally, that's really how you build a momentum around these.
So I think there's a lot of wisdom expressed, already. Megan, I'd love to hear from you as well and your perspective. I'm a both and person in terms of my perspective on what it takes to make change. And then I'm a firm believer in using every tool in the toolbox. And one of the benefits, there are certainly drawbacks, but one of the benefits of being a truly global world that we are, right? Globally connected, embedded with each other. Not many people actually are living off the land, growing their own food, making their own product and not connected in some way. We are connected to each other, and that connection means that the locus of power isn't in any actually one place. It actually is quite distributed. So there is opportunity when there are when there are actors in that ecosystem that are not using that power in ways to advance the things that those in this on this call are talking about are really important for us to advance, that we can take that power and we can kind of move around it. And I take, notwithstanding the fact that we are in really a moment of crisis and just fraught with fraught times, looking at the impact of systemic racism again, but how it's moved people to action. And I've seen a lot of people remind other people that it took people getting into the streets and taking action to affect things like the Voting Rights Act. It took people demanding things for legislators to change. So taking that kind of broad lesson and looking at it on these issues, I think about materials and not energy for now. And I think about how in 2017, Sir Attenborough, did the Blue Oceans 2 documentary that you might have seen, and you have at least seen some of the images, including that image, that stark image of someone pulling a straw out of the nose of a turtle. Yeah. That image alone and that documentary provoked a huge scale community and consumer concern and interest in materials and single-use plastics. And as a result, there have been bans on straws and bans on plastic bags. Now, was that a distraction potentially from bigger, higher impact issues? Conceivably, although I also see it as an interesting and important lesson in how change happens and how we can actually both inform and then tap the power of people to advance the sustainable development agenda. And so I think that there are opportunities. I think that we have to, as a practitioner in sustainability for 20-something years, I'm constantly reminded that I talk jargon and I, don't speak in ways that are really kind of engaging with people or help them understand what it is that needs to happen, or how it really impacts their lives. So I do think that we actually, thinking about that partnerships piece, we do need to broaden our networks and talk to people who are organizers, talk to people who are engaging in communications, and figure out how do you actually help people even understand this sufficiently to be able to advocate for the policies and then the products, the systems, the business solutions that help us create better living and working environments.
Hear, hear.
Great. So Michele, I'm going to throw it back to you. We have gone through our list of questions in the chat, and we have about 6 minutes left. What a perfectly timed group we are. So go for it.
Thank you. Megan, did you want to respond to Catherine before I jumped in?
Oh, Catherine, I thought that was beautifully done and worded. And I would just add, yeah, I think science communication is something, especially us in academia, really struggle with. But I'm also assuming that once you really get into a field, you do talk a lot in jargon. And I think something that we all really should focus it on is how we are connecting with people and their values and how we are telling stories. And I think, as you said, Catherine, visual imagery, radio, media, videos are all things I think that we can use to kind of connect with people in terms of, how we're bringing this movement forward. And I would also say that environmental justice is racial justice. So there are, small things that we can do as we move forward. And I think that it is I think it is structural. I also think that it is grassroots. As we have seen this week, across the entire country, people have been marching and cities have been reevaluating how their police are funded, how they are moving and interacting with the public. So I think in just 1 week, what we can do, I think there's a lot of hope for things that we could do in environmental justice and in clean technology as well.
Touche. Thank you. Well, I hope that we all stay connected within this panel and also our audience. Thanks again to our audience for the questions, the contributions, the insightful ideas, and this will be out on YouTube as a full-fledged video. This is one of the charts I found, and I think, Tom, you said, wow, it's very massive. Clean tech is massive and very broad. Well, when I keep looking at this, it reminds me of, how much there is left to be done and how much we haven't even touched yet. So thank you for sharing your thoughts and ideas. Thank you for making the time and all the prep. Very well run panel, and Hub 88, thank you again for inviting us, and we'll see you all soon next month.
Right. You have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye now.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Thanks again.